You get $15, Dad. That was my son's final offer, his voice dripping with the satisfaction of a man about to inherit his mother's $160 million fortune. He wanted me front and center at the will reading, just to witness his victory, to see my face when my complete and utter worthlessness was read into legal record. What he didn't know was that my ex-wife, even in death, had one last move to play, and I was the centerpiece of it. Before I tell you how it all unfolded, let me know in the comments where you're listening to this story from, and be sure to like and subscribe if you believe that sometimes the quietest people have the most devastating plans. The sound of the wood planer was my symphony. For the past 5 years, it had been the soundtrack to my life. Each high-pitched whine was a note, each shaving of walnut a verse. Here in my small workshop in Austin, Texas, I wasn't a failed architect. I wasn't a discarded husband. I was just a carpenter, a man who created solid, honest things from broken pieces. My hands, calloused and scarred from years of work, knew the truth of the wood. It never lies. It doesn't deceive. It simply is, with all its knots and imperfections. I respected that. The smell of sawdust and linseed oil was the only cologne I wore. I was working on a rocking chair, feeling the smooth curve of the armrest take shape under my guidance. It was a peaceful existence, a quiet one. Then the peace was shattered. My old flip phone resting on a cluttered workbench began to vibrate, its buzzing a harsh intrusion. I hit the kill switch on the planer, and the sudden silence was almost deafening. Wiping my hands on my dusty jeans, I walked over and looked at the screen. 2 words stared back at me, cold and foreign: Nathan Thorne. 20 years. That's how long it had been. 20 years without a single phone call that wasn't a demand or an insult. No Christmas cards. No birthday wishes. Just a vast, empty silence built brick by brick, with accusations and contempt. I had assumed that silence would last until one of us was in the ground. I suppose I was half right. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of sawdust, and flipped the phone open. My voice was rough from disuse. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was sharp-clipped and belonged to a world a million miles away from my workshop. It was the voice of New York City traffic and $1,000 suits. Julian. He never called me Dad. Not anymore. I was Julian. A name he spoke as if it were a mild inconvenience, like a piece of lint on his jacket. Nathan. Your mother is gone. There was no sadness in his voice, no grief. He delivered the line with the emotional detachment of a news anchor reading a teleprompter. Last week. A stroke. It was fast. I stood there motionless, looking out the workshop window at the sun-drenched Texas yard. A strange numbness washed over me. Isabella. Gone. The words didn't seem to fit. She had always been a force of nature, a hurricane of ambition and creativity. Brilliant, beautiful, and utterly destructive. To think of her as just gone felt wrong. He grew impatient with my silence. Did you hear me? The funeral? I started to ask, my throat dry. He cut me off. It's over. You weren't on the list. Now listen, this is why I'm calling. Her lawyer requires your presence. The reading of the will. It's this Friday, 10 a.m. sharp. The offices of Caldwell and Finch, Manhattan. Don't be late. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. A command delivered from on high from a son who had long ago appointed himself king of a world I no longer belonged to. I finally found my voice, keeping it steady. I have no reason to be there, Nathan. Isabella and I made everything clear 20 years ago in that courtroom. I have nothing that belongs to her, and she has nothing that belongs to me. A sound came through the phone then, a short, ugly bark of a laugh. It was a sound stripped of all humor, a noise of pure, unadulterated scorn. And that sound, more than anything else he could have said, stirred something deep inside me. "Oh, I know you're not getting a dime," he sneered. Don't be a fool. My mother despised you. But it's a legal formality, a procedural thing. You have to be there in person to officially hear that you are a zero. A documented, notarized confirmation of your irrelevance to this family. He paused, letting the poison sink in. Personally, I just want to be there to see your face. I want to watch that quiet, fake dignity of yours crumble when you hear it read out loud. It's the only entertainment you're good for anymore. The humiliation was so raw, so direct, it was almost impressive. This wasn't the anger of a wounded son. This was the calculated cruelty of a victor wanting to rub his opponent's face in the dirt. "Are you finished?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Almost," he said, his tone dripping with condescending amusement. "Don't worry about the trip back. I'll spot you $15 for the bus ride home. Think of it as a parting gift." And then the line went dead. Click. I stood there, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone. The silence of the workshop rushed back in, but it was different now. It was heavy, suffocating. Anger, an old emotion I had buried under years of sawdust and resignation, began to smolder. It wasn't a raging fire. It was a hot coal, buried deep, slowly glowing red. He hadn't invited me to a will reading. He had summoned me to a public execution. My execution. He wanted a show. Fine. He would get one. I closed the phone and set it down with deliberate care. I walked over to the half-finished rocking chair and ran my hand along its smooth, honest curve. Then I turned and walked out of the workshop into the small house attached to it. I went to my closet, past the flannel shirts and worn jeans that were my daily uniform. In the very back, covered in a thin layer of dust, was a garment bag. I hadn't touched it in 2 decades. I pulled it out and unzipped it. Inside hung my only suit. A charcoal gray suit. The same one I had worn on the day my old life ended. I would wear it again for the beginning of his. Friday morning. The cab ride from LaGuardia felt like passing through another dimension. The quiet, sun-baked streets of Austin were a distant memory, replaced by the towering canyons of steel and glass that made up Manhattan. I paid the driver the fare, stinging more than I expected, and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The air was colder here, sharper. The building for Caldwell and Finch was exactly what you'd expect. It didn't just occupy the street. It dominated it. A sheer cliff of dark glass and polished granite. I pushed through the revolving glass doors, and the noise of the city was instantly cut off, replaced by a deep, reverent hush. The lobby was a cathedral built to worship money. The floors were acres of white marble so polished I could see the distorted reflection of the ceiling lights high above. The walls were paneled in dark, glossy mahogany, smelling faintly of lemon oil and old wealth. I had spent my entire life designing buildings, but I had never designed a space like this. This wasn't built for people. It was built to intimidate, to remind every person who entered just how small they were. And I felt small. I was wearing my only suit, the charcoal gray one. The fabric was good wool, so fine you couldn't find it much anymore, but it was 20 years out of style. The cut was too generous, the shoulders too padded. It was clean. I had pressed it myself back in Austin until the crease on the pants was sharp as a knife. But it was old. It was the suit I had worn to the divorce hearing. The last time I had seen Isabella face to face. The last time I had seen her look at me with anything other than cold disappointment, fueled by the lies my son had whispered in her ear. I could still smell the faint trace of mothballs, a scent of preservation and decay. As I walked toward the reception desk, my old leather-soled shoes made a lonely click-clack on the marble. The sound seemed to echo embarrassingly loud in the tomb-like silence. A few young lawyers, men and women in their 30s, wearing suits that cost more than my truck, glanced up from their phones. Their eyes didn't linger. They scanned, categorized, and dismissed me in a single fluid motion. I wasn't a client. I wasn't a threat. I was just old. An anomaly. I felt like a smudge of grease on a pristine white canvas, an ink stain spreading across a legal document. I didn't belong, and that I knew was the entire point. This was Nathan's first move, summoning me here to his territory, to this fortress of power while I was wearing the armor of my greatest defeat. I reached the reception desk, a slab of marble that looked like it had been carved from a mountain. The woman behind it was young blonde and wore a headset so sleek it looked like part of her. "Can I help you?" Her voice was bright, but her eyes were bored. "I'm here for a 10 o'clock meeting," I said, my voice sounding rough like unsanded wood. "The reading of Isabella Thorne's will. My name is Julian Thorne." Her eyes flickered. The name Thorne registered, but the face didn't match. She was expecting, no doubt, someone who looked like Nathan, someone who belonged. Not me. A flicker of confusion, then disdain passed over her features, before the professional mask snapped back into place. "Of course," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Mr. Harrison is expecting you. Please take a seat. They will be with you shortly." She gestured toward a waiting area, a collection of low-slung black leather sofas arranged around a massive glass table. I sat down on the edge of one. The leather was cold and stiff. I clasped my hands together. My rough, calloused carpenter's hands resting on the fabric of my old suit. I looked at the abstract, expensive art on the walls. It meant nothing to me. It was just color and shape designed to fill a space. I was a ghost, a relic from a past they had all agreed to bury, and I was sitting here waiting to be told that I was officially, legally worth nothing, just as my son had promised. The anger from that phone call, the hot, simmering coal, burned a little brighter. I was not here to be humiliated. I was here to finish this. They didn't just walk into the waiting room. They made an entrance. It was Nathan, and he wasn't alone. He moved with an unearned confidence, the swagger of a man who has never been told no in his life. He wore a navy blue Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. It fit him perfectly, accentuating a physique that was maintained by personal trainers, not hard labor. His hair was slicked back. His watch was a glint of gold and steel at his wrist, and his expression was one of bored entitlement. Trailing him were his accessories. The first was a young woman, impossibly thin and startlingly beautiful in a severe, artificial way. She was squeezed into a tight designer dress and clutched a Hermes purse like it was a life raft. Her name, I would learn, was Sophia. She was engrossed in her phone, her thumb flicking endlessly across the screen. The second was a man in his 40s with a tan that was too perfect for October in New York, and teeth that were too white to be real. He had the fixed, predatory smile of a shark. This had to be Kyle, the financial advisor. They weren't a family mourning a loss. They were a pack of predators circling what they believed was their kill. Nathan strode to the reception desk, not even glancing in my direction. "Nathan Thorne," he announced, his voice echoing slightly in the large space. "Harrison is expecting me." The receptionist, who had barely looked at me, was suddenly all smiles and efficiency. "Yes, Mr. Thorne. Right away, Mr. Thorne. Please have a seat." He turned then, intending to claim one of the leather sofas, and his eyes finally landed on me. He stopped. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a cat that has just cornered a mouse. He walked over his expensive shoes, silent on the marble. His two companions followed, their curiosity piqued. "My God," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "You actually came." He looked me up and down, his gaze lingering on my old suit, the worn collar of my shirt. "I guess you really do need that $15. Sophia." The young woman looked up from her phone for the first time. She let out a short, high-pitched giggle, the sound like breaking glass. Kyle's shark-like smile widened. He looked me over not as a person, but as a piece of outdated furniture, something to be cleared out and thrown away. He didn't even bother to offer a hand, just a dismissive clinical assessment. Nathan gestured vaguely in my direction, addressing his two disciples. "This," he said, and the way he paused was an insult in itself, "is my father." He said the word father as if it were a dirty secret, an unfortunate biological fact he was forced to acknowledge. It was an apology. He was apologizing to them for my very existence, for my shabby suit, for my worn-out shoes, for my failure to be someone who reflected his own perceived glory. I remembered him at 10 years old. Christmas morning. I had spent weeks in my workshop back when I still had one hand crafting a detailed model of a battleship. I had been so proud of it. Nathan opened the box, looked at it for a second, and tossed it aside. "It's not a brand name," he'd whined. "I want what my friends have." Isabella, always quick to fix any problem with money, had swooped in with an expensive video game console. She had created this monster one spoiled whim at a time. This man standing before me wasn't a man at all. He was just a collection of appetites wrapped in a $10,000 suit. I didn't say anything. I just looked at him. I met his smug, arrogant gaze and held it. I didn't flinch. I didn't defend myself. My silence seemed to unnerve him more than any angry retort could have. He was expecting a reaction, begging, pleading, anger. Anything to confirm his power over me. I gave him nothing. I just sat there, a ghost in a gray suit, watching the show he was so desperate to produce. His smile tightened. He wasn't having as much fun as he'd planned. He turned away from me, speaking to Kyle. "So the first thing we do is liquidate the real estate portfolio in..." He was cut off by the sound of a heavy oak door opening. A man stood in the doorway, and the entire atmosphere in the room shifted. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The show was about to begin. My son stood there, basking in the glow of his own arrogance, and my mind drifted back. Christmas morning. He was 10. The whole house smelled of pine needles and baking cinnamon. I had spent weeks in my workshop, the old one, crafting a model battleship for him by hand. It was a perfect replica of the USS Missouri. I'd carved the tiny cannons, coiled the miniature ropes, hand-painted the flag on the stern. I was so proud of it. I thought he would love it. He opened the box, looked at it for maybe 3 seconds, and then tossed it aside onto the floor. "It's not a brand name," he'd announced to the room. "I want what my friends have." And Isabella, my wife, she hadn't corrected him. She hadn't explained the value of a gift made with love. She had just swooped in with a brightly wrapped box containing the latest, most expensive video game console. She wasn't being kind. She was being easy. She had built this monster piece by piece, buying his affection because earning it was too much work. And even then, I think she knew it. The memory was so clear, it was almost a taste in my mouth, bitter and sad. It was cut short by the sound of a heavy oak door swinging open. A man in his 60s stood in the doorway. He was tall and wore an impeccable gray suit that spoke of quiet authority, not flashy wealth. This was Mr. Harrison. He had the face of a judge, impassive and difficult to read, with eyes that didn't just see you. They assessed you, weighed you, and filed you away. The quiet confidence he radiated instantly silenced the room. Even Nathan seemed to shrink a little. His gaze swept across the room, passing over Nathan and his entourage, as if they were part of the furniture, and then his eyes landed on me. First, he held my gaze for a moment, and I saw a flicker of something in his expression. It wasn't pity. It was something closer to understanding. He walked toward me. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice level and respectful. "Thank you for coming." He didn't offer a hand, but the words were a handshake in themselves. They were a simple acknowledgement of my presence, of my right to be there. Then, and only then, did he turn to my son. "Mr. Thorne," he said. The same name, but the tone was different, colder, formal, stripped of any warmth. The slight was so subtle that a lesser man might have missed it. But Nathan's entire world was built on a fragile scaffolding of status and special treatment. The fact that I, the outcast, had been acknowledged first was a direct challenge to his authority. I saw a flicker of annoyance in his eyes, a tightening of his jaw. He tried to cover it with a wave of dismissive arrogance. "Let's get this over with, Harrison." He snapped, his voice sharp with impatience. "I have a reservation at Per Se to celebrate. I don't intend to be late." Mr. Harrison's expression didn't change. He simply nodded once. "As you wish," he said, turning and holding the door to the conference room open. "This way, gentlemen." The conference room was just as cold and imposing as the lobby, but with an added layer of finality. A single massive table made of dark polished mahogany filled the center of the room. It was so reflective it looked like a dark pool of water. Floor-to-ceiling windows lined one wall, but they didn't offer a view of the sky, just a close-up sterile look at the gray skyscraper across the street. It was a room designed for executing contracts and crushing opponents. Nathan naturally took the seat at the opposite end of the table from the door, the one that clearly marked him as the new head of the family. He leaned back, spreading his arms wide, staking his claim. Sophia and Kyle sat on either side of him, like a queen and bishop protecting their king. I took a seat near the door, an afterthought. I was just there to fill the chair, a legal requirement. I placed my calloused hands on the table, a stark contrast to the perfect, unblemished wood. Mr. Harrison walked to the head of the table. He didn't sit. He placed a thick, leather-bound document on the surface with a soft, definitive thud. The air in the room seemed to get thinner. He deliberately pulled his chair out, sat down, and then with methodical slowness reached into his breast pocket and produced a pair of simple gold-rimmed reading glasses. He put them on his movements, precise, unhurried. He was in complete control. He opened the binder. The pages were thick, creamy. He cleared his throat. "This," he began, his voice filling the room, "is the last will and testament of Isabella Montoya Thorne, dated August 4th of this year. I, Isabella Montoya Thorne." Even from the grave she was making a statement. She had taken my name in marriage, but she had built her empire with hers. Montoya. A name that was a brand. A name worth, according to my son, $160 million. Harrison's voice was a monotone, a perfect instrument for legal documents. "Being of sound mind and body, I do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all former wills and codicils heretofore made by me." Nathan sighed, a gust of impatient air, and glanced at his expensive watch. He was already bored. "First," Harrison continued, "I direct that all my just debts and funeral expenses be paid from my estate." He paused, then turned the first page. "Second, I give and bequeath the sum of $50,000 tax-free to my housekeeper, Maria Gonzalez, in gratitude for her 25 years of loyal service and her unending patience." I saw Nathan roll his eyes. He muttered something to Kyle that I couldn't hear, but the word peanuts was unmistakable. I, however, found myself smiling, just a small internal twitch of the lips. Maria. I remembered her. She had been with Isabella even before the money got truly big. A kind, quiet woman who had always had a cup of hot coffee for me in the kitchen after one of my spectacular arguments with Isabella. She had seen it all. She deserved every penny. It was a flicker of the woman I once knew. Isabella could be generous. She just chose her moments. Third, Harrison read on, his voice unwavering, I give and bequeath the sum of $100,000 to the Monarch Butterfly Preservation Fund. This time it was Sophia who reacted. She let out a little disbelieving scoff. Butterflies, she whispered to Nathan loud enough for me to hear. Is she serious? I felt a sudden sharp pang in my chest. Not sadness. Something more complicated. Nostalgia. Before Nathan was born, before Montoya Designs was an empire, Isabella and I had driven an old Jeep down to Mexico. We had slept in cheap motels and hiked for miles into the mountains to see the monarch sanctuaries. I remembered her standing in a clearing, the air thick with millions of orange and black wings, her face tilted up to the sky, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, Julian," she had whispered. "It's like all the souls in the world flying home." She had remembered. Even after all the bitterness, all the lawyers, all the silent years, she had remembered that day. This wasn't just a bequest. It was a message. Fourth, I give and bequeath the sum of $25,000 to my driver, Miguel Rodriguez, for his excellent service and for never once commenting on the colorful guests my son brought to my home. Nathan sat bolt upright. "What the hell does that mean?" Kyle put a hand on his arm. "It's nothing, Nathan. Just a little joke. It means nothing." But Nathan was getting visibly agitated. This wasn't going according to his script. He was supposed to be the star, and the opening act was getting too much attention. He began to tap his fingers on the mahogany table. A sharp, impatient tap, 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 that echoed in the quiet room. Harrison ignored him and continued. "Fifth, I give and bequeath my collection of first edition modernist poetry to the New York Public Library." Tap, tap, tap. With the exception of one volume, a 1922 copy of T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land, which I leave to... Nathan slammed his hand flat on the table. The sound was like a gunshot. "Harrison, for God's sake," he boomed. "Can we skip the charity donations and the servants' tips? My time is valuable. I have a reservation. Just get to the main event. The real estate, the portfolio, the money. Just get to the part where it all goes to me." The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Mr. Harrison stopped reading. He did not look startled. He did not look angry. He simply stopped. Very slowly, he raised his head, his eyes still behind the reading glasses. Then, with a deliberation that was more threatening than any shout, he took the glasses off. He folded them. He placed them on the table, and he stared at my son. His gaze was flat, cold, and utterly unimpressed. It was the look of a man who had dealt with spoiled children his entire life and was in this final moment done with it. "Mr. Thorne," Harrison said, and his voice had dropped, losing its monotone, becoming a precise, sharp instrument. "This is not a negotiation. It is not a business meeting. It is the legal proclamation of a deceased woman's final wishes. I will read every single word in this document exactly as your mother wrote it. And you will sit there and you will listen. Is that clear?" Nathan's face flushed a dark, ugly red. He had been challenged. He had been dressed down like a child. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Kyle, who subtly shook his head. He was trapped. Harrison held his gaze for one beat longer, then satisfied, he put his glasses back on. He picked up the document. He deliberately flattened the page, took a small, composed sip of water from a glass beside him, and cleared his throat. He had made my son wait. He had re-established control. "Very well," Harrison said, his voice returning to the neutral monotone. "Let us continue. Fifth, as I was saying, I leave my first edition copy of The Waste Land to..." He paused, and I could have sworn I saw the barest hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "Ah, no. That's been struck. Let's move on. Sixth, regarding the personal associates of my son." Harrison's gaze lingered on Nathan for a moment longer, a silent assertion of dominance. Then, as if a switch had been flicked, he returned to the document, his voice resuming its steady, neutral cadence. "We now move," he said, "to Article 6, regarding the personal associates of my son Nathan Thorne." I saw Kyle, the financial advisor, sit up a little straighter. His shark-like smile was back fixed in place. He smoothed the lapel of his expensive suit, adjusting his posture, ready to receive his expected bonus for managing Nathan's anticipated fortune. Sophia beside him finally put her phone down, her eyes bright with greedy anticipation. Harrison continued. To my son's financial advisor, Mr. Kyle Vance. He pronounced the title with a slight, almost imperceptible emphasis, as if placing it in quotation marks. I give and bequeath the sum of $5,000. Kyle's smile froze. 5,000. The number hung in the air, shockingly small. It was an insult. It was less than the cost of his suit. I saw his knuckles whiten as he gripped the edge of the table. Nathan looked at him annoyed, as if Kyle's disappointment was a personal affront. But Harrison wasn't finished. I bequeath this sum with the attached legally binding recommendation that he use it to enroll in a course on professional ethics. My own financial records show he has a significant need for a refresher on the topic. The shark-like smile vanished, replaced by a mask of pale, stunned fury. His head snapped toward Nathan, his eyes wide. What is this? He hissed, his voice a low vibration of rage. He had just been called a crook in a room full of people. And, Harrison continued, not missing a beat, turning his attention to the young woman beside Nathan. To my son's current companion, Sophia, I leave her the high-quality imitation handbag she attempted to swap for my authentic Birkin bag in my closet last month. If Kyle was stunned, Sophia was incinerated. Her perfectly made-up face turned a dark, blotchy red. Her mouth dropped open. She hadn't just been insulted. She had been exposed. Exposed as a petty common thief. In front of the man she was clearly trying to trap. In front of the lawyer. In front of me, the ghost she hadn't even bothered to acknowledge. The crazy old hag, she shrieked, her voice cracking, all pretense of sophistication gone. She lied, I never— Shut up! Nathan roared, his voice bouncing off the mahogany walls. He wasn't defending her. He was silencing a problem. His carefully constructed image was crumbling. His entourage was being dismantled piece by a dead woman's words. He was furious, not because they were insulted, but because this was taking too long. This was messy. This was not part of his victory celebration. It doesn't matter, he snarled at both of them. It's nothing. It's a joke. Who cares about a bag? Who cares about $5,000? He turned his furious gaze back to the lawyer. Get on with it, Harrison. Stop wasting time with this trash and get to my part. I sat there perfectly still, and for the first time in 20 years I felt a connection to Isabella. This was the woman I had married. Not the victim my son had painted her to be, but a brilliant, cold, and lethally precise woman. She wasn't just reading a will. She was settling every last score. She was burning down the peripheral parts of Nathan's life, isolating him, leaving him with nothing but his own greed. She was in her own way clearing the table before the main course. Mr. Harrison, completely unbothered by the outburst, simply waited for the shouting to subside. He looked at Nathan, his expression unreadable. As I have already stated, Mr. Thorne, I will read every word. Now, if I may continue. I sat there watching the fallout from Isabella's words. Kyle looked like he'd swallowed poison, and Sophia was trembling with pure, unadulterated rage. And I thought to myself, that was the Isabella I remembered. She never forgot a slight. She never let an insult go unanswered. She kept a perfect, detailed ledger of every wrong ever done to her. And even in death, from inside a leather-bound document, she was still surgically precise. She was still settling her accounts. Harrison let the silence settle for a moment longer, then he turned the page. The room tensed. This was it. After clearing away the trash, this was the main event. Article 7, Harrison said, his voice dropping back into that neutral legal tone. To my son, Nathan Thorne. Nathan leaned forward. His breathing was shallow. His knuckles were white on the table. He had forgotten his humiliated companions. All his focus, all his greed, was now laser-focused on the lawyer. I give and bequeath the penthouse apartment on Park Avenue. A huge sigh of relief escaped Nathan. A genuine, full-body exhale. The color returned to his face. He smirked, shooting a triumphant look first at Kyle, then at me. The penthouse. The crown jewel. It was his. And, Harrison continued, my complete collection of Patek Philippe watches. Nathan's smirk widened into a grin. He laughed a short, sharp bark. Yes, yes, now we're talking. He looked at me, his eyes gleaming. Hear that, old man? The Pateks. All of them. Harrison raised a single finger, stopping Nathan's celebration cold. However, he said, and the word hung in the air like a blade, the watch collection is stored in a secure safe located within the penthouse. The single key to that safe. Harrison paused. He looked down at the document, then looked up, his eyes finding mine across the long expanse of the mahogany table. I have entrusted to his father, Julian Thorne. The silence that followed was absolute. It was so complete I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. Sophia and Kyle lost in their own humiliation moments, before snapped their heads toward me. Nathan just stared. His face, which had been flushed with victory, went pale. His grin dissolved. What? His voice was quiet, disbelieving. What did you just say? He asked Harrison, his voice rising. The key, Mr. Thorne, was entrusted to your father. Nathan slammed his hands on the table and stood up, the chair scraping violently behind him. What are you talking about? Is this a joke? A sick joke? He pointed a shaking finger at me. Him! He hasn't seen her in 20 years. He doesn't even know where she lived. Nobody. Every eye in the room was on me, and I was just as stunned as he was. I stared at Harrison, my mind reeling. A key Isabella had given me, a key. What did it mean? Was it another one of her games? Another way to twist the knife even from the grave? I had no key. I had no idea what any of them were talking about. I just sat there, the ghost in the gray suit, suddenly, and very uncomfortably, the center of everyone's attention. My son was screaming. His face was a mask of disbelief and rage. But I wasn't really in that cold mahogany room anymore. As Mr. Harrison shuffled the papers, the sound of the thick, creamy stock sliding against itself seemed to pull me back through 20 years of anger and silence to a different kind of crisis. I wasn't in New York. I was in our old house in Connecticut. It was 2005. It was 3 in the morning and the house was dark, except for the single light in Isabella's home office. I found her there, not crying, but worse. She was just sitting, staring at a wall of spreadsheets, her face pale and completely blank. She looked broken. Montoya. Designs. The company that was her life, her passion, her entire identity was bleeding out. It was on the verge of total catastrophic collapse. She had overextended, pouring millions into a luxury resort project in the Caribbean. She had trusted the wrong partners. The entire deal was built on a foundation of bad permits and shifting sand. And now it had all fallen apart. The banks were calling in their loans. Her investors were threatening to sue her into oblivion. She was facing not just bankruptcy, but disgrace. I remember sitting down next to her in that dark office, the computer screen casting ghostly shadows on her face. It's over, Julian, she had whispered, her voice hollow. Everything I've built. It's all gone. They're going to take the house. They're going to take everything. She wasn't just afraid of being poor. We had been poor before when we started. She was terrified of being a failure, of being seen as a fool. Her entire world was built on her reputation as a brilliant, infallible businesswoman. And now that reputation was about to be publicly executed. She looked at me, her eyes, usually so full of fire and ambition, were just empty. They're talking about criminal negligence. She'd said the words barely audible. They're saying I misled them. I looked at the woman who was my wife, the mother of my son, the brilliant, infuriating, passionate woman I had loved, and I knew in that moment that she was drowning, and she was about to pull all of us down with her. The memory from 2005 solidified, sharp and agonizing. Isabella sitting in her office, utterly broken. She didn't just look broken. She was broken. For a week, our house was a tomb. The phones rang off the hook, calls from angry bankers and betrayed investors. Isabella just let them ring. She stopped eating. She stopped sleeping. She would just sit in her office, staring at the company's financials on her computer screen, watching the numbers bleed into a sea of red. She was paralyzed. She was drowning. And then, about a week into this living nightmare, a hand reached out. It didn't come from a bank. It didn't come from a friend or a trusted colleague. It came from an encrypted email routed through a server in the United Arab Emirates. It was an offer for a meeting. A private equity group I had never heard of, based in Dubai. They said they had been following Montoya Designs for some time. They saw potential. Isabella was too far gone to go, too paranoid to even speak on the phone. She was a ghost. She begged me to go. I was still her husband, her partner in life, even if I wasn't her partner in business. I was the architect. I understood the construction side of her empire better than anyone. So I went. I met them in a sterile, soulless conference room at a hotel near JFK Airport. There were 3 of them. They were not bankers. They were young, impeccably dressed in dark, identical suits, and they had the dead, cold eyes of men who had seen too much. They were polite. Too polite. It was the kind of politeness that feels more threatening than a direct insult. They laid out the terms on the table. It was on the surface a miracle. It was breathtakingly simple. They would inject $100 million into Montoya Designs, effective immediately. Enough to stabilize the Caribbean project. Enough to pay off the angriest bankers. Enough to silence the lawsuits that were threatening criminal charges. It was a total rescue. I sat there stunned. In return, I asked, my voice cautious, "What do you want in return?" The lead negotiator, a man with a faint British accent, just slid a thin leather-bound folder across the table. "We are investors, Mr. Thorne. We simply want to invest in future projects. We believe in the Montoya brand. We want to help you build." I brought that folder home. It felt heavy, like it was made of lead. Isabella, desperate for any shred of hope, tore it open. For the first 10 minutes, she was ecstatic. She was laughing, crying, holding the pages to her chest. "We're saved, Julian, we're saved." But I was reading the fine print. I was an architect. I spent my entire life reading contracts. I spent my life looking at blueprints. And this wasn't a bailout. It was a blueprint for a crime. "Isabella," I said, my voice quiet, cutting through her celebration. "Look at this. The projected costs." I pointed to the addendum, the appendix, the part they hoped we wouldn't read. It detailed the future projects they wanted to fund. A series of luxury high-rises. "Look at the numbers," I said. "They're wrong. They're all wrong. The cost projections, they're inflated by at least 40%. She didn't get it at first. She was too blinded by the $100 million lifeline. "So what?" she said, waving her hand. "They're overpaying. That's their problem, not ours." "No," I said, and a cold dread was creeping up my spine. "That's how it works. That's the point. It's not an investment, Isabella. It's a washing machine." The smile on her face flickered. "What are you talking about? They give us $100 million in clean capital now." I explained, my voice flat. "It saves the company. It makes us whole. In return, we build their future projects. But we don't bill them for the real cost. We bill them for the inflated cost. We bill them for $140 million. We pay their shell companies, their suppliers in the Cayman Islands, that extra $40 million. We take their dirty money and we make it clean. We make it look like legitimate construction payments." I tapped the signature page. They're not investing, Isabella. They're laundering. And they want to use your company, your name, as the detergent. The color drained from her face. She finally truly understood. She had spent her entire life, her entire soul, building the Montoya name into a symbol of luxury, quality, and integrity. And these men were going to use it to wash their blood money. "No," she whispered. "I won't do it." "Then we declare bankruptcy," I said, stating the simple, brutal fact. "It's over." "No!" she screamed. The word ripped out of her throat. She jumped up, pacing the office like a caged animal, her hands twisting in her hair. "No, I can't. You don't understand, Julian." She grabbed the front of my shirt, her nails digging into my chest. "If we go bankrupt, they'll investigate. They'll do a forensic audit. They'll find the Caribbean mess. They'll say I was negligent. They'll say I committed fraud." Her eyes were wild with terror. "It's better than this, Isabella," I pleaded. "This is a criminal enterprise. This is the mob or worse." "I don't care," she shrieked. And then she just collapsed. She didn't faint. She just crumpled onto the expensive Persian rug, her strength gone. She wasn't a CEO anymore. She wasn't an empire builder. She was just a terrified woman trapped. "Julian," she wept, her voice muffled by the carpet. "Please, please, I can't go to jail. I can't go to jail." She looked up at me, her face a ruin of mascara and terror. It was a look I had never seen on her, a look of absolute bottomless desperation. "I can't lose the company," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I can't. It's me. It's everything I am. If I lose Montoya Designs, I'm nothing. I'm just nothing." She grabbed my hand, her own ice cold. "And Nathan," she choked out. "What about Nathan? He's at Yale. He's on top of the world. Do you want him to be the son of a convict? Of a bankrupt failure? He'll be humiliated. He'll hate me. He'll hate us. Please, Julian. There has to be a way. Please." She was hysterical. She was right. She was trapped. If she refused the deal, she would be ruined and jailed for fraud. If she took the deal, she would be ruined and jailed for money laundering. She had built her own prison. I stood there watching her fall apart. This brilliant, driven, impossible woman. The woman who had built an empire from nothing. The woman who was also at times so blinded by her own ambition, she couldn't see the cliff edge until she was already over it. I looked at the contracts on the desk. I looked at the blueprints for the fake condos. I was an architect. I knew this world. I knew how these deals were structured. I knew how to hide costs. I knew how to create shell corporations for supplies and labor. I knew how to build the legal firewalls, how to compartmentalize a project so the dirt wouldn't spread. I could see a path. A single, terrible, dangerous path. A way to do what they wanted. But to keep her name. Her signature. Her public face. Clean, she begged again. "Julian, please, what are we going to do?" I looked at her, the woman I had loved, the mother of my son, and I made the choice. The one. The choice that would define the rest of my life. The choice that would save her company and in doing so would destroy me. I reached down and pulled her to her feet. I held her by the shoulders. "Stop," I said. My voice was calm. It was the preternatural calm of a man who has just accepted his fate. "Stop crying. Go to your room. Go to bed." She looked at me, her eyes wide and confused. "What? You are going to have no part in this," I said, my voice firm. "You will not sign these papers. You will not take these meetings. You will not be on these emails. You will focus on designing. You will focus on saving the public face of the company. You will do what you do best." A tiny, desperate flicker of hope sparked in her tear-filled eyes. "But the deal. The money, the contracts." I turned from her and walked to the desk. I picked up the heavy leather-bound folder. I looked at the signature page, the one meant for her, the president and CEO of Montoya Designs. "Let me handle this," I said. I became a ghost. While Isabella went back to being the face of Montoya Designs, attending galas and approving fabric swatches. I moved into the shadows. I became the intermediary. I was the one who flew to Zurich, to Dubai, to Grand Cayman. I was the one who sat in sterile hotel rooms negotiating payment schedules with men who had no last names. Back in New York, I used my architect's license, my name, my reputation, to create a series of shell corporations. Thorn Construction, Thorn Project Management, Thorn Architectural Supply. I built a labyrinth of legal entities, a complex firewall designed for one purpose: to stop the dirt from ever reaching Isabella. The $100 million bailout came through. Montoya Designs was saved. The bankers were paid. The lawsuits vanished. Isabella was celebrated in the financial pages as a genius who had weathered the storm. And then the second part of the deal began. The laundering. I was the one who signed the inflated construction contracts. I was the one who approved the wire transfers to anonymous accounts. I was the one who personally oversaw the creation of fraudulent invoices, certifying that millions of dollars of Italian marble or German steel had been delivered to sites when in fact nothing had arrived but a bank receipt. I was good at it, terrifyingly good. My architect's mind, so used to building solid real structures, was just as adept at building hollow fake ones. For 2 years I lived a double life. I was a respected architect by day and a high-stakes money launderer by night. I saved her company. I saved her name. I saved her from prison. But you can't move that much dirty money without someone noticing. The FBI didn't come for Isabella. They didn't even know she was involved. They came for me. They had been tracking the Dubai group for years. They saw the money flow into my shell companies. They saw the inflated contracts. They saw the fraudulent invoices. They saw my name, my signature, my architect's seal of approval on documents that were pure fiction. They didn't kick the door in. It was quiet. 2 men in dark suits waiting for me in my office one morning. They laid it all out. They had the wire transfers. They had the surveillance photos of my meetings at JFK. They had me. Dead to rights. They offered me a deal. "Tell us who you're working for," the lead agent said. "Give us the organization. Give us the people in Dubai. Give us the real beneficiary of this scheme." I looked at the file on the table. My name was on every page. Isabella's was nowhere. I had done my job too well. I had a choice. I could give them Isabella. I could tell them the whole story. How she was terrified. How she had begged me. How I had done it all to save her and our son from ruin. They might have been lenient. They might have understood. Or I could take the fall. I thought about Isabella, terrified and broken on the office floor. I thought about Nathan at Yale with his entire future ahead of him, a future built on his mother's glittering empire. An empire that was now technically funded by criminals. So I made the second choice, the one that sealed my fate. "I don't know what you're talking about," I told them. "I was overextended. I made some bad deals. I got sloppy with the books. There's no organization. It was just me. I cut corners. I was desperate." I gave them a confession. But not the one they wanted. I confessed to professional negligence, to tax evasion, to falsifying business records. I played the part of a foolish, greedy architect who got in over his head. To protect Isabella from a money laundering conviction, I had to plead guilty to something. So I did. I didn't go to prison. My lawyers, paid for by Isabella's now stable company, made sure of that. But I lost everything else. I lost my architect's license, revoked, permanently. I lost my reputation. My name was dragged through the mud. Julian Thorne, disgraced architect. I was a pariah. And that's when my son Nathan twisted the knife. He was 22, home from Yale, and he saw his chance. He went to his mother, not in comfort, but in anger. "He betrayed you," Nathan had screamed at her, a performance I learned about later. "He used your company. He embezzled money behind your back. He's a criminal. He humiliated you. He humiliated me." He presented her with an easy narrative, a simple story. In his version, I wasn't the savior. I was the villain. And Isabella, seeing her company saved, seeing her name completely clear, and seeing my name utterly destroyed, she took the easy way out. She chose the story that made her the victim. She chose her son's version of the truth. She filed for divorce. She claimed she was the wronged party, the trusting wife betrayed by her greedy criminal husband. And she let Nathan, our son, believe it. She let the whole world believe it. She never said a word in my defense. She just let me burn. That was the price for saving her. The voice was calm, but it sliced through 20 years of memory like a sharp chisel. I blinked. The dark, desperate office in Connecticut dissolved, replaced by the cold, polished mahogany of the conference room. My heart was pounding. The past felt more real than the present. I looked up. Mr. Harrison was watching me, his expression neutral. But everyone else was staring at me. Kyle, the financial advisor, had a look of greedy calculation in his eyes. Sophia, the girlfriend, was looking at me as if for the first time, a flicker of curiosity in her otherwise vacant expression. And Nathan. My son was staring at me with an intensity that was almost frightening. His face was a thundercloud of suspicion and rage. The veins in his neck were standing out. "The key," he spat, his voice low and dangerous. "Where is it? What did she give you?" He was convinced this was a scheme, a final bitter trick played by his mother with me as her willing accomplice. He saw conspiracy in every shadow. I looked from his furious face to Mr. Harrison's calm one, searching for an answer. But there was none. My mind was a complete blank. The last 2 decades had been a quiet life of wood shavings and solitude. A key to a safe full of watches. It was absurd. It was a detail from a life that was no longer mine. It felt like a line from someone else's script. I looked back at my son. His entire $160 million inheritance in his mind was now being held up by me, the ghost he had summoned here for his own amusement. I shook my head, not in defiance, but in genuine bewilderment. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said. And it was the absolute truth. My "I don't know" hung in the air, a simple, unadorned fact. Nathan stared at me, his face a canvas of pure disbelief, which quickly curdled into contemptuous rage. He was processing this new variable, this impossible complication. He was a bull that had been momentarily stunned by a cattle prod. But it only lasted a second. He let out a harsh, guttural laugh. It was a forced sound, a performance meant to signal that he was still in control, that this was all just a minor, absurd annoyance. "It doesn't matter," he snapped, waving his hand dismissively, as if swatting away a fly. "A key. You think I care about a key? You think I'm going to go on some treasure hunt with him?" He laughed again, louder this time. "I'll have a locksmith drill open that safe before lunch. It's irrelevant. A meaningless, sentimental game by a dying woman." He sat back down, but he wasn't relaxed. He was coiled like a spring wound too tight. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger at Mr. Harrison. "Enough of these games." He punctuated each word. "Enough of the servants, enough of the butterflies, and enough of the keys. Get to the point, Harrison. The main event, the assets, the 160 million. Read the part where it all comes to me. Read it, now." Mr. Harrison regarded my son over the top of his reading glasses. He showed no fear. He showed no annoyance. He simply let Nathan's command hang in the air, letting its own arrogance suffocate it in the heavy silence. Then, with that same infuriating, methodical calm, he adjusted his glasses, took a small, deliberate sip of water from a crystal glass, and turned the page. The sound of the thick, creamy paper turning was like a crack of thunder in the tense room. It was the sound of a judge turning to the final page of a verdict. He was savoring this. He was following Isabella's script to the absolute letter. "Of course," Mr. Harrison said, his voice returning to that flat, neutral tone. "We will now proceed to Article 8, the disposition of the primary estate, the residue of all property real and personal wherever situated." This was it. The air in the room was so thick I felt I could barely breathe. Nathan was leaning so far forward he was almost out of his chair, his whole body a single taut muscle of greed. Even Kyle and Sophia, despite their public humiliation, were watching with rapt, desperate attention. This was the moment that would make their own small humiliations worthwhile. Harrison read from the page. "Regarding all remaining liquid assets, stocks, bonds, properties, and controlling interest in Montoya Designs, LLC." He stopped. He deliberately paused, looking down at the page as if rereading a complex, unexpected clause. He was drawing out the moment. He was a master showman. "Come on," Nathan whispered, his voice a low hiss. "Come on." Harrison cleared his throat. "I decree the following. First, to my ex-husband, Julian Thorne." My head snapped up. Me? What was this? A sound like a strangled gasp came from Nathan. He inhaled so sharply, it sounded like he'd been punched in the stomach. His face, which had been pale with anticipation, went rigid. His eyes narrowed into tiny slits of pure, unadulterated hatred, and they were fixed laser-like on me. He wasn't breathing. He was just waiting. He was a bomb, and his fuse had just been lit. I could see the muscles in his jaw clenching and unclenching, grinding his expensive teeth. What in God's name was she doing? Was this her final cruelty, to give me some small insulting sum, a few $1,000s, just to rub his nose in it one last time before giving him the rest? Harrison continued, his voice perfectly, even betraying not a flicker of the drama he was unleashing. "To my ex-husband, Julian Thorne, I give and bequeath the sum of $15. $15. The words just hung there. It wasn't an insult. It was a public execution. It was a joke. A petty, cruel, and profoundly childish joke. But Harrison wasn't finished. He read the final part of the clause, the part that twisted the knife and locked it in place. $15 U.S. currency to be paid in cash. This is to cover the cost of the bus ride back to wherever it is he came from, a trip my son Nathan will surely be kind enough to suggest for him. It started as a snort, a choked, disbelieving sound. Then the dam of his self-control didn't just break, it evaporated. A laugh, a huge, roaring, braying laugh erupted from Nathan's chest. It was not a sound of humor. It was a sound of sheer, unadulterated triumph. It was a sound of such profound, malignant joy that it made the air in the cold room feel sick. He shot up from his chair, his body trembling with the force of his laughter. He pointed at me, his finger shaking his face, turning a dark, blotchy crimson. He was crying actual tears of malicious joy streaming down his cheeks. $15, he roared. The words bounced off the walls. $15. He doubled over, slapping his hand on the priceless mahogany table. Oh my God, $15. Kyle, who had been sitting in a stunned, humiliated silence, now seemed to catch the new current. He saw his path back into his patron's good graces. A slow, sickly smile spread across his face. Incredible, Nathan. Just incredible. Sophia, catching on, let out a high-pitched, sycophantic shriek of laughter. $15 for a bus. Oh, Nathan, she was hilarious. Wasn't she? Nathan howled, straightening up, wiping a tear from his eye. He was a performer, and he finally had his audience back. He looked at his two companions, his chest puffed with victory. She always had a wicked sense of humor, always. He had won. In his mind, the game was over. The insults to his friends were just appetizers. The confusion with the key was a meaningless tangent. This was the punchline. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He had been publicly, legally, and financially declared the victor. And I had been publicly, legally, and financially declared nothing. Less than nothing. A $15 joke. His laughter finally subsided, simmering down into a low, smug chuckle. He adjusted the cuffs of his Tom Ford suit, a gesture of absolute restored control. He was the king again. He turned his gaze on me, and all traces of humor vanished, replaced by a cold, reptilian satisfaction. A dark, evil smile played on his lips. "Well," he said, his voice dripping with false pity. "That's that, I suppose." He walked around the table, a predator circling its kill, and he stopped just a few feet away from me. He looked me up and down, his eyes filled with a disgust so profound it was almost tangible. "It's over, old man. You heard her. $15. He reached into his pocket, the one on his $10,000 suit, and pulled out a slim alligator skin wallet. He made a show of opening it, his movements slow and deliberate. "You know what?" he said, his voice a low, confidential sneer. 15 is a little insulting. Here." He pulled out a $20 bill and threw it on the table in front of me. The bill skidded across the polished wood and came to rest right in front of my hands. "There, 20. Don't say I never gave you anything." And he stared at me, daring me to react. Daring me to yell, to cry, to reach for the money. I did none of those things. I just sat there. I looked at the $20 bill. I looked at his smug, victorious face. And I waited. I didn't feel humiliated. I didn't feel angry. I didn't even feel sad. I just felt a deep, profound sense of anticipation. Because I knew Isabella. And I was watching Mr. Harrison. And Mr. Harrison was not moving. He was sitting at the head of the table, his face a perfect neutral mask, his hands resting on the document. He was letting the performance play out. This wasn't the end. This was the intermission. My stillness, my absolute lack of reaction, infuriated Nathan more than any outburst could have. His smile faltered. "What's the matter, old man?" he sneered. "Speechless cat got your tongue," he scoffed. "Whatever. It's done. It's all mine. Finally, you can get the hell out of here now. Go back to your sawdust shed or whatever hole you crawled out of. And don't forget your bus money." He turned his back on me, a final act of dismissal. He walked back to his chair, clapping Kyle on the shoulder. "Right, per se. We have a lot of champagne to drink." He grabbed his suit jacket, ready to leave, ready to start his new life. Nathan had his jacket halfway on. He was beaming, clapping Kyle on the back so hard it was almost a punch. "Right," he said, his voice loud and booming. "Per se. I'm going to buy the entire champagne list. Harrison," he called over his shoulder, not even looking at the lawyer. "Just have your girl send the papers to my office for me to sign. I'm done here." He turned to leave, a king departing his own coronation. "Mr. Thorne?" The voice cut through the air like a sheet of ice. It wasn't loud, but it had a core of absolute steel. It stopped everyone. It stopped Nathan in his tracks, his jacket half on one foot, already turned toward the door. He turned back, his triumphant, laughing face slowly hardening. "What?" Mr. Harrison was still seated. He hadn't moved an inch. He was looking at Nathan, and his expression was no longer neutral. It was cold. "Please, sit down." The smile on Nathan's face didn't just fade. It was wiped clean as if by a solvent. The blood drained from his face, leaving the blotchy red patches from his laughter looking like burns. "What did you say?" He whispered, his voice suddenly hoarse. "I said..." Harrison repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "Sit down. I have not finished reading." "Finished?" Nathan's voice cracked. "What are you talking about?" "You read it. $15. The joke. It's over. You're done." Mr. Harrison, with the slow, deliberate motion of a man revealing the winning card, reached down to his briefcase, which sat on the floor beside him. He did not touch the leather-bound will that was already on the table. He brought up a second, thinner folder. It was simple manila, but it was bound with a thick red wax seal. It looked important. That, Mr. Harrison said, tapping the large leather binder on the table, was the conclusion of the original last will and testament. He then placed the new folder on the table. "This," he said, his voice dropping, "is a codicil, a legally binding addendum." He looked directly at Nathan, his eyes unblinking. "It was signed, witnessed, and notarized 3 weeks ago, 1 week before your mother's stroke." He paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. "And its primary clause," he said, his eyes flicking to me for just a fraction of a second, "explicitly states that it supersedes and replaces all previous articles pertaining to the disposition of the primary estate." Nathan didn't just sit down. He collapsed back into his chair, his body moving like a puppet whose strings had been cut. His face was a mask of waxy white shock. The triumphant blotchy red was gone. He looked small. Kyle and Sophia were completely frozen. They looked at the new red-sealed document on the table as if it were a bomb. Mr. Harrison broke the seal with a small, sharp knife. He unfolded the single sheet of paper inside, which was attached to several other thicker documents. He put his reading glasses back on. "This," he said, and his voice was no longer neutral, "is a letter from your mother, addressed to you, Nathan, but with the legal instruction that it be read aloud here today in the presence of all parties, and its contents form the basis of the new Article 8. He began to read, and it was no longer his voice. The words were pure, uncut Isabella. "To my son, Nathan." Harrison paused, then continued. "I am writing this because I am finally done with being a coward. For 20 years I have let you believe a lie that I created, a lie that I nurtured, a lie that I allowed to destroy a good man, your father." "What?" Nathan whispered. It was a dry, rasping sound. "The story you grew up with," Harrison read, "the story of your criminal scheming father who betrayed me and embezzled from the company, is a complete fabrication, the opposite of the truth." "No!" Nathan's voice was a sudden, strangled shriek. He lunged halfway across the table, his eyes wild. "She was sick. She was senile. That's not her. This is a fake. He pointed at me. "He got to her. He manipulated her. This is a scam." He turned to his lawyer, Kyle, his eyes pleading. "Kyle, tell him, this is inadmissible. She wasn't competent. We'll contest this. We'll tear this apart." Mr. Harrison, looking profoundly bored, held up a hand to stop the tirade. He slowly lifted one of the other documents that had been in the sealed folder. "On that subject," Harrison said, his voice cutting through Nathan's panic, "attached to this codicil is a full 40-page psychiatric and cognitive evaluation of your mother conducted by a panel of 3 independent, board-certified neurologists and psychiatrists. It was performed at her request 72 hours before this document was signed. I will summarize their findings for you." He looked directly at Nathan, his eyes like ice. "In their expert, unanimous, and legally binding opinion, your mother was, and I quote, entirely lucid, in full command of her faculties, and possessed of a mental acuity that was in fact superior to 99% of individuals in her age group." He dropped the report onto the table with a heavy thud. "She was not, Mr. Thorne, insane. She was, as she states here, finally done. Now, if I may continue." Nathan sank back, his mouth open, making small gulping sounds. He was out of moves. He was out of air. Harrison returned to Isabella's letter. His voice once again became the vessel for her confession. "The truth, Nathan, is this. 20 years ago, Montoya Designs was on the brink of total, catastrophic failure. I had made a series of terrible, reckless decisions. I had overextended. I had trusted the wrong people. I was facing not just bankruptcy, but criminal charges for fraud and negligence. I was going to lose everything. The house, the company, my name. I was going to prison. I closed my eyes. I was back there. In that dark office, her on the floor, weeping, begging. I felt the old cold weight of that night settle on me. We were given one way out, Harrison read on, a deal with a group of unsavory investors. A deal that would save the company, but would require us to launder their money through its operations. I was trapped. If I said no, I went to prison for fraud. If I said yes, I would eventually go to prison for money laundering. I was a coward. I collapsed. I was ready to let the entire world burn. And then, your father stepped in. I heard a small choked sound from my left. It was Nathan. He was shaking his head, his hands over his ears, as if he could block the words. Your father, the man you have spent 20 years calling a criminal, made a choice. To protect me. To protect you. He took the deal. He put his own name, his own career, his own license on the line. He created the shell companies. He took the darkroom meetings. He handled the wire transfers. He did the dirty work, so that my name, the Montoya name, could remain clean. Harrison's voice was relentless. He funneled all the risk to himself. He built a legal firewall around me, around the company, and he stood in the fire. And when the FBI finally came, they came for him. Because that is exactly what he had planned. He confessed Nathan. He confessed to crimes he didn't commit. Negligence, fraud. To cover up the real crime, the money laundering that I was responsible for. He lost his license. He lost his reputation. He lost his entire career. He did it. To save me. To save the company that you now so arrogantly claim as your own. And what did I do? Harrison read, his voice dropping. What did I do as my reward for this sacrifice? I listened to you. I listened to your poison. You told me he was a criminal. You told me he had humiliated us. And I, in my shame and in my cowardice, I agreed. I let that be the story. I divorced him. I abandoned him. I let you, our son, treat him like trash. Because I was terrified that if you ever knew the truth, you would look at me with the same contempt you had for him. I was a coward, Nathan, and I let you become this greedy, arrogant, empty shell of a man who mocks the very person who sacrificed everything so you could have this life. The $160 million fortune you were so eager to claim, it exists for one reason and one reason only. It exists because your father, Julian Thorne, saved it. The silence in the room was absolute. It was a vacuum, heavy and suffocating. Harrison's voice reading Isabella's final words was the only thing that existed. He was no longer just a lawyer. He was the vessel for a confession that was rewriting 20 years of history in real time. Nathan was completely still. He wasn't shaking his head anymore. He wasn't covering his ears. He was just staring. Staring at the polished, empty surface of the table, his face a mask of waxy, corpse-like white. He looked like a man who had been told the world was ending, and he was the only one who hadn't known. Harrison continued, his voice steady, relentless. Your father, he read, is not a criminal. He is not a failure. He is a hero. The kind of man who makes a sacrifice so deep, so complete, that people like you and me can't even comprehend it. He burned his own life to the ground to keep us warm. And I let you treat him like garbage. I encouraged you to treat him like garbage. I used your contempt for him as a shield to hide my own shame. Every time you mocked him, every time you called him a washed-up old man, it was one more stone on the wall I built to protect myself from the truth. The truth that I was the weak one, that I was the failure, that I was the one who had betrayed this family. My hands were shaking. I clasped them together on the table, my knuckles white. I could feel the hot sting of tears behind my eyes, a feeling I hadn't experienced in decades. It wasn't sadness. It was validation. A terrible, painful, 20 years too late validation. Harrison's voice pushed on each word, a hammer blow dismantling the entire foundation of my son's life. This $160 million fortune, he read. This empire you've been waiting to inherit, like a spoiled prince, it does not exist because of you. It does not even exist because of me. It exists in its entirety because of Julian Thorne. You, Nathan, Isabella's words were now a direct, brutal assault. Have never worked a real day in your life. You have never built anything. You have never sacrificed anything. You are just a parasite, a creature of appetite. You have done nothing but spend money that you didn't earn, all while sitting in judgment of the one man who actually earned it for you. You are a consumer living off the scraps of his honor. The words landed. I saw them land. Nathan made a sound. It was a small, broken animal noise, a sound from deep in his chest. No, he whispered to the table. No, she didn't. She's loved me. No. He wasn't defiant anymore. He wasn't angry. He was just hollow. The entire narrative of his life, his brilliant, infallible mother, his criminal, worthless father, his own status as the rightful heir had been utterly, completely, and irrevocably incinerated in the space of 5 minutes. He slowly, mechanically slumped down in his chair. He didn't just sit back. He crumpled. His $10,000 suit, his armor of arrogance, suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for him. He looked like a child. A lost, broken, and terrified child. No, he whispered again, his voice cracking. It's a lie. She wouldn't. Harrison looked up from the page, his eyes cold. She did, Mr. Thorne, and she had it all notarized. He turned the page. And now, the conclusion. The room was no longer just a conference room. It was a courtroom. It was a confessional. It was a tomb. And now it was a stage for the final act. Nathan was a hollow shell slumped in his expensive suit. He was staring at the table, but I knew he wasn't seeing the polished wood. He was seeing the entire 20-year-long lie of his life, now exposed in the harsh fluorescent light. Kyle and Sophia were frozen, their own petty ambitions rendered completely irrelevant. They were just collateral damage in a war they never even knew was being fought. Mr. Harrison's voice, which had carried the weight of Isabella's confession, now shifted. It became harder, more formal. This was the judgment. This was the final legal and binding word. He turned the last page of the codicil. Your mother's letter, he said, looking directly at Nathan, serves as the legal and moral preamble to this, the final binding article of her last will and testament. It supersedes all that came before it. This is Article 8, the final disposition. He cleared his throat. He began to read. Therefore, he read Isabella's final words. Having stated the unvarnished truth, and in an effort to correct insofar as money is able a betrayal that can never be undone. He paused. His eyes scanned the room, making sure he had the absolute, undivided attention of every soul present. He did. The silence was so complete I could hear the tiny mechanical whir of the clock on the wall. I hereby decree, as my final wish and binding testament, he continued, his voice steady, all of my property, real and personal, wherever situated, all of my stocks, bonds, and liquid assets, my art collection, my private holdings, and most importantly, my entire unencumbered 100% controlling interest in Montoya Designs, LLC, and all its subsidiaries, an estate with a current estimated value of $160 million. He read the list of assets like a judge reading a death sentence. It wasn't a prize. It was a weight, an empire, an impossible burden. Nathan didn't move. He didn't breathe. He was a statue of a man, his skin the color of ash. All of this, Harrison read, I give, devise, and bequeath. He stopped. He stopped and he looked up. He didn't look at Nathan. He didn't look at Kyle or Sophia. His eyes, clear and steady behind his glasses, moved across the long, polished table. And they found me. He held my gaze. In that 1 second of silence, my entire life seemed to hang in the balance. My workshop, my sawdust, my quiet, solitary peace. I wasn't thinking about money. I wasn't thinking about victory. I was thinking, what has she done? What final, terrible, complicated game was this? I was still reeling from the confession, from the validation that had been stolen from me for 2 decades. The money, the empire, was a complication I couldn't even process. It was a different language. Mr. Harrison looked back down at the page. I give, devise, and bequeath to my ex-husband, Julian Thorne. The words didn't land. They just hung in the air. Julian Thorne. Me. The man in the 20-year-old suit. The man who had been summoned here for a public execution. I heard a sound. A small, wet, gasping sound. It was Nathan. But I couldn't look at him. I couldn't move. It felt as if the roof of the building had been removed, and the entire crushing weight of the New York City sky was pressing down on my shoulders. $160 million. Montoya Designs. It wasn't a gift. It was a life sentence. It was a chain. It was her way of pulling me back from my quiet obscurity, back into the world of glass and steel and contracts and lies that I had run from. I could feel my heart pounding a slow, heavy drumbeat in my chest. Thump, thump, thump. Mr. Harrison, bless him, didn't let the moment hang. He didn't let anyone react. He knew that the next words were the most important. He knew the money was just a tool. The reason was the payload. He continued reading, his voice firm, projecting into the stunned, dead silence of the room. I leave this, he read, not as a gift, but as a payment, as a long overdue and wholly inadequate compensation for the career I allowed to be destroyed, for the honor I allowed to be stolen, and for the family I, in my cowardice, allowed to be broken. And that was when it hit me. It wasn't about the money. It was never about the money. It was about the reason. It was her final, written, legally binding confession. It was her apology. It was her from beyond the grave handing me back my name, handing me back my honor. She wasn't just giving me her company. She was telling the world that it should have been mine all along, that I was the one who had saved it. I looked down at my hands, my rough, calloused carpenter's hands. They were resting on the polished, perfect wood, the hands of a man who built things, and I was now the owner of an empire I had never wanted. A small sound, a whimper, came from across the table. It was Nathan. He wasn't a monster anymore. He wasn't a king. He was just a boy. A 42-year-old boy whose entire life had just been revealed as a lie. A lie his mother had told him, and a lie his father had paid for. Kyle and Sophia were already ghosts. Their faces were blank, their minds unable to process this reality. They had hitched their wagons to a falling star, and now they were just irrelevant. I looked at Mr. Harrison. He was watching me. He was waiting. $160 million. The company, the penthouse, the watches. Isabella, my brilliant, impossible, destructive wife. Even in death, she had to have the last word. She had to control the entire narrative. She had exonerated me. She had made me whole. But in doing so, she had chained me to her legacy forever. She had given me everything, and in a way she had taken everything all over again. My simple life was over. My son, Nathan, was a ruin. He was a building that had been imploded. He sat there, his mouth half open, his eyes blank and unfocused, still trying to process the fact that the entire $160 million universe he thought he was inheriting had just vanished. Vanished and been handed to me, the man he despised more than anyone on earth. He was breathing in short, shallow gasps like a drowning man. Kyle and Sophia were completely adrift. Their golden goose hadn't just stopped laying eggs, it had exploded. I could see the panic in Kyle's eyes, the gears in his rat-like brain spinning, trying to find a new angle, a new con, and coming up with nothing. Sophia was just white. Her mask of makeup looked like a porcelain shell, and it was cracking. Harrison, the executor of this devastating will, was not finished. He still held the codicil. There was one last piece of business, and finally, Harrison said, his voice as unforgiving as a judge's gavel, "We come to the final bequest." He looked at my son. "And for my son Nathan Thorne." At the sound of his name, a tiny pathetic flicker of something sparked in Nathan's dead eyes. It wasn't hope. It was more primal than that. It was the desperate animal instinct not to be left with absolutely nothing. He slowly, painfully raised his head, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow, fixed on Harrison. He was waiting for what? $1 million, a trust fund, an allowance, some small scrap from the table he thought had been set for him. Mr. Harrison looked at him. There was no pity in his gaze. There was no emotion at all. It was just the final cold execution of his duty. "For my son Nathan," he read, "who has already received a lifetime's worth of fortune, both in the money he spent so freely and in the sacrifices he never acknowledged. I leave him only one thing." Harrison paused. He looked down at this paper, then back at Nathan. "I leave him precisely what he so thoughtfully and publicly offered to his father." I felt my breath catch. No. Nathan's confused, broken gaze shifted to me, then back to Harrison. He didn't understand. He couldn't make the connection. His mind was too shattered. I don't," he stammered. "What?" Mr. Harrison did not reply. Instead, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached to the side of his desk. He opened a single drawer. His hand went inside and emerged holding one item. A check. A single bank-certified cashier's check. "Mr. Harrison, on behalf of the estate," he said, "was authorized to prepare this in accordance with your mother's wishes." He held it up for a moment. Then he placed it on the polished mahogany table. He slid it across the vast expanse of wood. It skidded, making a small whispering sound, and came to a stop directly in front of Nathan. $15, Harrison said. His voice was flat. Final. "Your inheritance, Mr. Thorne, as your mother specified, for your bus fare." Kyle, the shark, the financial advisor, said nothing. He didn't make a sound. He just stood up. Quietly, smoothly, he pushed his chair in. He didn't look at Nathan. He didn't look at me. He just evaporated. He gathered his own briefcase and walked quickly and silently out of the conference room. He was gone. Sophia, on the other hand, was not silent. She looked at the check. She looked at Nathan's broken, pathetic face. And her expression, which had been one of shock, curdled into something else. It was pure, unadulterated disgust. The revulsion of a predator for a mate who had suddenly become weak. The man she had attached herself to, the source of the Birkin bags and the Park Avenue life, was nothing. He was a $15 man. "You," she hissed, her voice low and full of venom. "You're pathetic." She stood up, grabbed her own expensive purse, the real one, and without a single look back, she too walked out of the room. So the click-clack of her high heels on the marble floor outside was the only sound. And then there were three. The check. The $15 check. It sat on the polished wood, a final brutal monument to my son's arrogance. Nathan stared at it. His breathing, which had been shallow and gasping, just stopped. For a full 5 seconds, he was completely motionless. He was a statue of ruin. I could see the tiny muscles in his cheek twitching, the only sign of life. And then he exploded. It wasn't a word. It was a scream. A primal guttural roar of such pure, undiluted rage that it felt like a physical blow. It was the sound of a man who had not just lost everything, but who had just realized in one horrifying instant that he was nothing. No! His arms flew out, sweeping the table. Glasses, notepads, the heavy water carafe. Everything went flying. The crystal shattered against the mahogany wall. "I'll sue you!" he shrieked, his voice cracking, spittle flying from his lips. He wasn't talking to Harrison. He was screaming at the universe, at his dead mother. "I'll sue all of you. She was crazy. She was senile. I'll prove it. I'll burn it all to the ground." He spun, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, his eyes wild and bloodshot. And then his gaze landed on me. All of his rage, all of his humiliation, all of his pain focused into one single burning point of hatred. "You!" he bellowed. "This was you! You did this! You got to her! You manipulated her! You! Thief!" And with that he lunged. He didn't just walk, he launched himself across the room, his chair crashing to the floor behind him. He wasn't a businessman anymore. He was just an animal, blind with fury. His hands were curled into claws, and he was coming right for my throat. I didn't even have time to stand. I just braced myself. But Harrison was faster. His hand, which had been resting calmly on the desk, moved with lightning speed to a small black intercom button. He pressed it. Once. Before Nathan could even get halfway around the massive table, the conference room doors burst open. Not one, but 2 security guards filled the doorway. These were not the mall cop types. These were men who were built like refrigerators, professionals in dark suits with earpieces, the kind of men who protect billionaires and presidents. Nathan, blinded by his own rage, didn't even see them until they had him. One guard grabbed his left arm, the other grabbed his right. They spun him around, his $1,000 suit jacket ripping at the seam, and pinned his arms behind his back with brutal, practiced efficiency. "Get your hands off me!" he screamed, his voice a pathetic mix of fury and panic. He struggled, thrashing against their grip, but it was like a fly struggling against steel. Mr. Harrison stood up slowly. He looked at the wreckage of his conference room. He looked at the struggling, weeping, screaming man held captive by his security. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Remove him," he said, his voice flat and cold. "You can't do this to me," Nathan shrieked as they began to drag him backward out of the room. "I am Nathan Thorne. I own this building. I'll have your jobs. I'll... And Mr. Thorne," Harrison added, his voice cutting through the tantrum. Nathan froze, his head twisting around, his eyes still wild. Harrison pointed to the small white check still sitting innocently on the table. "Don't forget your inheritance." That broke him. The last shred of his sanity snapped. He began to curse. He cursed Harrison. He cursed his mother. But most of all, he cursed me. "I'll kill you, old man! Do you hear me? I'll kill you!" He was still screaming, still fighting, as they dragged him out into the hallway and toward the elevators, his expensive shoes scuffing pathetically on the marble floor. The heavy oak doors swung shut, and he was gone. The heavy oak doors clicked shut. The silence that rushed in to fill the vacuum of Nathan's rage was profound. It was a thick, heavy quiet broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the distant muffled wail of a siren in the city far below. The adrenaline that had been holding me upright, the shock of the last hour, all of it drained away at once. I felt tired. Tired in a way that went bone deep. 20 years of exhaustion seemed to land on me all at once. I slumped in my chair, the old wool of my suit suddenly feeling heavy as armor. There were only 2 of us left. Me, the man who now owned everything, and Mr. Harrison, the man who had delivered the verdict. I looked at the chaos. The overturned chair, the shattered glass, the $20 bill that Nathan had thrown at me still sitting on the table next to the $15 check. I looked at Harrison. He was calmly straightening the documents, his face once again a neutral mask, as if a Category 5 hurricane hadn't just torn through his office. Only one question remained, the one loose thread. "The key," I said, my voice hoarse. "The watches. Why did she do that? Why involve me in that? It was cruel." Mr. Harrison stopped shuffling his papers. He looked up at me, and for the first time that day, a genuine human smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was a small, sad, knowing smile. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice softening, "that was your wife's final test for her son. A test. He failed spectacularly. She wanted to see if he would even for a moment be willing to humble himself and ask you for something, to see if there was any part of him left that could be redeemed." He shook his head. "And it was a message. For you." He reached into his breast pocket, the one he had taken his glasses from. He pulled out something small. It wasn't the thick leather binder or the sealed codicil. It was a key. A single old-fashioned small brass key. A house key. He slid it across the table. It made a small metallic tink as it stopped near my hand. "That," he said, "is the key she left for you. It was never about the watches. That part was just theater. A way to set the stage." I stared at the small, simple object. "Then, what is this for?" "It's the key to the penthouse," Harrison said. "But the safe inside the one she mentioned, it doesn't contain any watches. Nathan will have it drilled open, and he will find nothing but empty velvet boxes. Another final joke, I suppose." "So what's in it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What is this key really for?" Harrison leaned forward. "There is another safe, Mr. Thorne. A wall safe, hidden behind a painting in her private study. This is the key to that safe." He paused, letting the weight of his next words land. "In it," he said, "is the original evidence. Everything. The complete unredacted 2005 file. All the original wire transfers. All the shell company documents you signed. And most importantly, all the emails and letters she sent you, begging you to do it." My heart stopped. "She kept it all," Harrison said quietly. "She kept the entire unvarnished truth locked away for 20 years. The confession she wrote, it's all supported by this. She wanted you to be the one to find it. She wanted you to be the one to decide whether to make it public or not. The money, that was her apology, but this," he nodded at the key, "this was her giving you back your name." I reached out my hand, my rough calloused fingers closing around the small, cool piece of brass. The $160 million. That was a weight. It was a burden. A new prison. But this key, this was freedom. Here is the lesson and call to action to be added at the end of the story. This whole experience taught me a powerful lesson. The truth I've learned has a weight and a patience all its own. For 20 years, a lie poisoned an entire family, turning a son against the father who had secretly saved him. But a lie built on silence and shame cannot last forever. Isabella's final confession showed me that no matter how deeply it is buried, the truth will eventually claw its way to the surface. It proved that true honor is not about reputation, but about the silent, thankless sacrifices you make. In the end, a name cleared by truth is an inheritance worth far more than any fortune. What would you have done with the key and that $160 million burden? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.